Good morning. This is a meditation that I gave for the Unitarian Universalists Church on July 11th, 21. The title is Tipping Point. I want to start out with a question for you this morning. I want to ask you, what was a tipping point in your life? When was a time in your life when something unexpected happened that profoundly changed your future? I would like you to write down your answer on the paper that I passed out. Your writings and these pieces of paper are just for you. You won't be asked to share them. Here's the question again. What was an unexpected tipping point in your life? Maybe it was when you met a stranger who turned your world upside down, or a time when you were expecting one thing to happen and something completely different occurred. A time when something happened just out of the blue. No doubt you can all come up with a joyous tipping point, as well as ones that left you in a muddle. Let me tell you two of mine. The joyous one first. Nearly 20 years ago, the West Stockbridge Congregational Church was doing a search for a new pastor. It's a process that is exhausting and time-consuming. At the time, I was just a member of the church, as well as the head of the search committee. After many months of work, we called a woman by the name of Beverly Gallagher to be our pastor. But within 2 months of her arrival, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The church was in turmoil, heartbroken for her, and totally adrift as a congregation. What to do? Get a supply minister? Go through months more of a new search? The prospects were dismal until Reverend Allison Stokes suggested that maybe I should be the minister. She explained that under special circumstances, the UCC would accept my becoming a licensed minister, provided I met certain obligations and requirements. Now, a little backstory. As a teenager in the 1960s, I approached my pastor at that time and told him I wanted to be a minister. It was really all that I wanted. He kindly but firmly told me that that was impossible. Women simply could not be ministers. My hopes and dreams were quickly dismissed. But then came the tipping point, so many years later, when the Congregational Church called me to be their pastor and teacher. Who would have ever thought? This tipping point didn't come about by my planning or design, but it most certainly has changed the past 20 plus years of my life. My greatest desire was fulfilled. Here's another tipping point in my life. It's a hard one, and I'm sorry if it's difficult to hear, but stick with me. It was when I was in my 30s and living in New York City. One early morning, I was taking my dog out for a walk. The streets were empty and the day was soft. I had only walked a few yards from my door when I heard this enormous crash. In front of me, no more than 45 feet away, was a building with a canopy over its front entrance. What I saw was that something had crashed through the canopy and was lying on the sidewalk. I went over and saw the lifeless body of a young woman. No one else was there, just the two of us. My heart exploded and my mind raced to try to make sense of this tragedy. I wanted to know who she was and why this had happened. In the following days, I learned that she had had a serious mental illness and that inside her very upscale apartment, she had been living inside of cardboard boxes. So what was the turning point? It was the clear realization that that woman who took her life could have been me. And she could have been the person walking the dog. The realization was that we are not as different from one another as we think we are. We are all exquisitely fragile and amazingly strong creatures. And here is something else that both of these tipping points highlight. Neither of them were a product of my planning. Neither of them came about because of my efforts. Neither of them could I have ever anticipated, and yet both of them made a huge mark on who I am as a person. Both of them redesigned the architecture of my internal and spiritual life. Whatever your spiritual or religious practice, these tipping points happen in life. And like it or not, they happen as a part of life. The exact tipping point is not nearly as important as what we do with it, what we can learn from it, how we embrace it or not, and what it is that we carry forward. Yes, it was a terrible thing that young woman took her life. But the tipping point for me was to know that I was her witness, a witness to her despair, her suffering, her illness. And it turned my heart to the God of my understanding, not for comfort, but to hold us both in love. It opened my heart wider to what suffering is. It opened my mind to the unheeded needs of the mentally ill. But the greatest was that I bore witness, one human being to another, and that bearing witness, that pathos, has been with me from that day to this. Being called to ministry also seemed to come out of the blue. The tipping point came decades after my desire to go into the ministry was dashed. So when I was licensed by the UCC to be a minister, I wasn't so much elated as I was awed and forever changed by this long shut door opening to me and challenging me as to how I could answer that call. The thing that all tipping points have in common is that they remind us that we aren't as much in control of our lives as we'd like to think that we are. Things happen that aren't part of our plan. Things that we didn't anticipate or expect. And here's the clincher. Aside from naming a tipping point as good or bad, the greatest challenge and opportunity is to see what can be learned from it, how we can grow from it. And it's my thought that in doing this, it's essential to not just consider the tipping point from an intellectual or emotional perspective, but from a spiritual perspective as well. We are not just body and mind. We are body, mind, and spirit. And if we are to look at the tipping points in our lives, find meaning and carry that meaning forward, we have to engage our spiritual or religious beliefs. The young woman who took her own life was certainly a tragedy, but as a tipping point for me, what I carried forward was to realize that everyone is as broken as they are whole, that there is no judgment in empathy, that we all need to be listened to, and that all of us, without exception, are beloved by the God of their understanding. And the tipping point of being called to ministry, I've learned that life doesn't run on my timetable. That maybe my higher power decided I needed all of those years of living before I was ready to be a pastor. It taught me to work at living one day at a time and to realize that being called to ministry is ongoing. It also taught me to keep my face turned to God, no matter if my faith is strong or if it's riddled with doubt. Now, look at what you wrote. What did you write on your paper? What have you learned from your tipping points? What have you carried forward? Were you able to respond to your tipping points with your spirit, as well as your intellect and your emotions? How did your tipping points light your path? How did it affect, change, reshape, or grow your spiritual self? We are all walking together on this amazing and often bewildering path called life. I'd like to thank you for exploring this facet of your spiritual or religious being with me as we go along, lighting the way for each other. Namaste.